Welcome on into the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Insider for KSL Sports. I'm back. Second time this week. I am really enjoying and appreciate everybody's interest and feedback in the Utah Blockcast. It's been a lot of fun. Like I've said each and every episode, it has been a lot of fun to get back into sort of a more consistent groove. It means the season is right around the corner, and I think it's been a lot of fun to get back into that groove. So I have a goal this season to sort of get back to the roots of the Utah Blockcast, which, in the end was a super consistent podcast with multiple episodes every week. And, it was also pretty interactive with the listeners. So I think that's a big one. A big goal for me is getting back to those roots and all of that. So that's going to be my focus this year. And I'm excited for, everything going on with KSL Sports. They've been super supportive and even pushing me to do this, especially on YouTube. It's been a lot of fun to see this grow on YouTube specifically. So really excited about that. On the last episode, that was a good one. That was a fun one where we obviously previewed the running back position, but then I went through a little exercise of going through 5 guys who I thought each had a case as the most essential player, non-QB player on the roster. And I made the case for Dallas Vakalahi, Spencer Fano, Smith Snowden, Lander Barden, and Teo Johnson. And I opened it up to you guys, the listeners, Utah fans, and I got a lot of interesting feedback. It was really cool to see some of the responses. Obviously, there were a lot of votes for Smith Snowden and Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu, who it was really tough for me to leave off, that list of 5 guys. But there were even a couple votes for Tobias Merriweather, Wayshawn Parker, Scooby Davis. There were a handful of votes for various defensive linemen, and everybody had a pretty interesting case. So even Dylan Curtis and the kicking game got a couple of nods, which was super interesting. So really appreciate the feedback. Like I said, it's been fun to get that going again, to get that sort of interaction between the podcast and the listeners. I really do appreciate it. And I'm making that a big focus going into the 2025 season. So continuing that today, on today's episode, gonna take on the linebackers and that preview for fall camp. That'll be a fun one. There's a few things I'm looking forward to with that group specifically, and then after that breakdown of the linebacker position, I want to do a bit of a dive into Utah's recruiting class to this point in the cycle, which I think will be good for everybody, just to kind of reset and assess where we're at with Utah's class. Obviously, this has been a really interesting cycle given the revenue sharing and all that. But I think Utah, there's some things to be encouraged by, some things to be concerned about maybe, and all of that. But I want to dive into that. But first, Utah announced 7 new members of their Utah Athletics Hall of Fame. On Monday, they announced that CJ Cron, Georgia Debris, Starlo Tulele, Burnt Lund, Ashley Mason, Nate Orchard, and Kem Gardner have been named to the 2025 Hall of Fame class. A big honor for them, and really cool to see former athletes named to the Hall of Fame and get that recognition that they deserve. Contributors and all of that. With Kem Gardner specifically, he's played a big role in the support of the athletics program. So good to see that these guys are getting honor. These guys and girls, obviously, just a really cool opportunity for them to be recognized by the University of Utah. I think that's should continue to be a focus, is honoring the great athletes of the past, incorporating them more each and every year, and honoring them. I think that's a super important element to a healthy college program. So really cool to see that. Let's dive into this linebacker room. with Colton Swan leading the way. This is, man, what year is this for him? This is like year 8, year 9 for Colton Swan as the linebackers coach. Utah, man, he's done such a fantastic job for Utah over the last few years, bringing in a number of highly touted recruits, developing a number of players, Devin Lloyd and others, into NFL type prospects. This year he brings back a really good, experienced trio to lead the way, obviously with Lander Barton coming back for his senior season. A third-year player going into his second season as a linebacker in Jonathan Hall, and then a grizzled veteran and proven commodity in Levani Damuni, who's also going to have that extra motivation of coming back from injury and proving everybody and all the doubters wrong. So, and then there's a really exciting group of young linebackers as well. So, there's an interesting mix with this linebacking corps, and I think it's going to be one of the more interesting groups to kind of pay attention to. And so before we get into fall camp, obviously let's dive into what happened in spring ball. And I think like those 5 weeks were a really important and vital period for Utah's linebacking core. Obviously, despite what they bring back in Lander Barton and Levani Damuni and Jonathan Hall, I think there was, each player needed a really good, productive spring for various reasons. And I think, it was an important time for them, important 5 weeks to kind of get themselves where they needed to be. Obviously with Lander Barton and Levani Damuni dealing with different injuries, you wanted to see them get back on the field and sort of show the progress and signs of what they were prior to injury. So, getting into what we saw, there were encouraging signs from Lander and Levani, both of whom are returning for the 2025 season after dealing with injuries last year. Lander seemed, a lot more upbeat and lively, both in terms of his demeanor, but his movement. He looked a bit sluggish, slow last year. He just looked like the batteries have been recharged, and I think like it was really good to see that from him. Levani was limited coming back from his injury. He's now a year removed from his season-ending injury back in 2024. So he was limited. It was mostly out of precaution, but we still saw him, here and there throughout spring ball, and we saw those moments, those flashes of what he was prior to his injury. So, that's going to be a continued process for him, getting back to form and regaining that consistency. But we saw the flashes from him without a doubt throughout those 5 weeks. Perhaps the most encouraging thing we saw during spring ball was the development from John O'Hall, both in terms of his physical development, but also he just looked more comfortable operating as a linebacker. He looks bigger, he looks thicker. He's embraced this linebacker role, and I think that's pretty significant for Utah. So he definitely made a good impression during spring ball. Then a couple other guys, Knight Lopes and Trey Reynolds, were the primary backups, and they got a lot of valuable reps. Reynolds is just so steady and consistent operating as an in-the-box linebacker. And then, Lopes is a little bit more versatile where he can do different things. He can, line up off the edge. He can drop into coverage pretty comfortably. He can do a lot. And I think there were some exciting moments from him. Just the consistency is still coming along for him. So, all in all, this was a good spring for those guys. For the freshmen, Christian Thatcher, Cyrus Polo, Matiaki Halu, and then Elijah Ellis, who's returning for his redshirt freshman year. This has been a bit of a strong introduction to the linebacker room at Utah. It's definitely, I would say that linebacker, man, in terms of the jump from high school to college, it's a significant jump for linebackers because the physicality is just so drastically different. When you're operating as a linebacker as a senior, you are more often than not the most dominant, the most athletic, the most physical. You get to college and it's a wake-up call. Now you're kind of the low guy on the totem pole. And I think that's always a bit of a wake-up call for freshman backers. But there was had the chance to talk to Christian and Cyrus during spring ball, and they both were just loving the process and what they were learning, and the guys that Lander and Levani and those guys taking them under the wing. So all in all, it was a really productive spring for Colton Swan and his group. So getting into fall camp and sort of the three keys that I've been running through with each group, I think priority number one is who emerges as the quarterback of the defense. Obviously Karenni Reed, he's moved on from the program, and we saw last season just how valuable his presence was and is to the defense. He provides individual production and playmaking, but it was that knowledge and leadership and confidence that he provided, that he instilled in everybody around him. He was the quarterback of the defense, and without him, we saw a bit of a drop off in terms of the play of everybody on the field. And I think that's a significant thing that Utah, they need somebody to step up in that role. And Utah, obviously that conversation is going to start with Lander Barton, who not only, he played better to finish the year, both in terms of his own play, but I think he also emerged as a leader, mostly by example and just being out there on the field with his guys. I think the big question for him is he ready to not only lead the defense by example with his play, but can he become that sort of mastermind, that quarterback, right? That's what we saw from Devin Lloyd in his final season. He took it all on. He was the quarterback. He was that guy. And I think that's going to be, a big key for him in terms of his own personal development and maximizing his potential, as a linebacker. I think that would be pretty significant if he can take on that role. And, with what we saw during spring ball, it looks like he was taking on more of that, pointing things out, making sure everybody was lined up correctly. It seems like that was a big point of focus for him during spring ball. Maybe Jono, maybe Levani step up to take on that role. I think that would be awesome to see Jono, step up in that manner after, just a year in the role. I think that would say a lot about him and sort of the trajectory that he's on. And then, Levani, he could also too fill that role thanks to his experience of what he's seen and what he's been through over the years. But regardless of who, Utah definitely needs to find one that will, and I think that will be priority number one for Colton Swan and this group. The next big key is just solidifying the depth and the sort of rotation that Swan wants to implement this season. There's certainly a defined top three with Lander, Jono, and Levani. Then it seems that Reynolds and Lopes are the primary backups behind them. Are one of those two capable of cracking the top three? Can Reynolds push for more time, as a MAC linebacker? Can he, edge his way into things? Can Lopes offer a little bit more, dynamic versatility where he can do some interesting things and add some different looks to that linebacker spot? I think there's a lot of optimism around, those two, but can one of those two push the top three to crack that top three? I think will be really interesting. And then two, which gets into point number three, is pushing the freshmen, right? Pushing them to the limits and seeing what they're capable of. I think Utah brought in, three really talented freshmen this past signing class in Thatcher, Paulu, and Halu. The three of them all have really promising qualities and projections. They're viewed as guys who will be counted on to lead this unit into the future, right? Once Lander and Levani move on, it's going to be up to Christian Thatcher. It's going to be up to Cyrus Polo to kind of take the mantle with this group. And I think pushing those three guys will be an important element of fall camp, because They have potential to be guys in this room, not only down the road, but a guy like Thatcher and Polu have instant impact potential. Are they ready to take on opportunities this season? All three have been with the program all off season. They went through winter workouts, they went through spring ball, and that's significant to their acclimation process, and would help them prepare for playing time in year one. So that's going to be another thing, and which gets back to point two. Can any of those three freshmen push Reynolds or Lopes for playing time to crack that sort of rotation? I think that'll be really interesting. But overall, there's a lot to feel good about, but certainly some question marks with this group. And so I think fall camp is going to be important from top to bottom, right? From Lander, Levani, Jono. There's certainly a lot of room for improvement, from those three specifically. How much can Reynolds and Lopes close the gap on those two and helps sort of solidify the depth? And then, the biggest X factor are within the group are the freshmen and what they could potentially add in terms of depth and playmaking to this group as well. So some really interesting things with this group, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun to see what sort of strides this group has made from spring ball, particularly that freshman group. So that's what I've got on the linebacker room. Let's switch gears to recruiting and dive into Utah's 2026 recruiting class. To this point of the cycle. Obviously, we're only in July. We still have 5 months to go in the cycle where these guys will sign in December. And, I think like I've said, there's some encouraging things that we've seen with Utah's recruiting so far. There's also some concerns and question marks, and I think they're valid. Over the past 3 or 4 cycles, the summer recruiting efforts have increased each and every year. The number of players visiting in the month of June has increased, and the importance of landing, top targets by summer's end has grown substantially, right? And so, this year there was a new twist added with revenue sharing becoming a thing. We've seen a handful of prospects essentially have deals reported, in the mold of guys getting deals in the NFL, free agency deals in the NFL. So it's been similar to what it's been over the last couple of years, but certainly a new twist added to it as well, which has been really interesting. And so with Utah and their recruiting efforts specifically, like I said, there's some things to feel good about, some things to question, to have concerns over maybe. Obviously, we're all waiting on one last significant domino to fall with the number one player in the state, Celeste Moa. It still sounds like, there's a back and forth battle between Utah and Tennessee for Moa. And, it's been close where it seems like Moa was set to announce and then held off. But, they're talking to folks, from what I've gathered, there was never a set date, outside of what Blair Angulo reported being July 9th as the date. I think most, the sources that I've talked to have felt that mid-July was going to be just the general time frame for when we might see Moa announce a commitment. And so, for a player like Moa, obviously there's a lot of impatience because we're all waiting anxiously to see him announce his decision. But I think there should be plenty of room for patience for a player of his caliber. And so, obviously, like I said, one last domino to fall on the summer recruiting efforts, and that would significantly impact, Utah's class and how it looks. But currently, Utah's class ranks 52nd in the country and 10th in the Big 12. They have the 10th highest average rating at 86.82. And the 10th biggest class in terms of quantity at 17 commits. So those numbers, in a vacuum, are a bit concerning. But again, I think there's, keep in mind that, Moa's potential commitment would change things quite a bit. I think he'd elevate Utah's class to the mid 30s nationally. They'd jump into the top 6. I think they'd be 5th in the Big 12. And then, the average rating would jump nearly half a point from 86.82 to like 87.25, somewhere in there. So again, Moa's commitment would be pretty significant and help Utah on that front. And then, additionally, it would mean a lot to their in-state recruiting and the representation from within the state. And I think that's a big key for Utah, is landing Moa, the number 1 player in the state, to help sort of solidify your in-state presence. Because currently, Utah has just 3 commits from the state of Utah, whereas, your rival BYU has they have around 10 commits from within the state. So, Moa's commitment would be significant in terms of bolstering your presence in the state of Utah, which is pretty important, obviously. But I want to look at the class more than just how it ranks, the average rating and the number of commits. I really want to sort of assess how well Utah's done to address actual needs on the roster. And so I'm going to pull this up here, playing with a new tool here. And make sure I've got that set correctly. Yeah, there we go. So if you're not on YouTube, watching this on YouTube, you're going to be like, what the heck? But on YouTube, I've got a display of sort of Utah's scholarship roster, and obviously scholarship in quotation marks, because are these guys even on scholarships anymore? Like, with what they're getting paid? I don't know. But, looking at assessing the class and what Utah's done with it to this point, it's interesting. So addressing just the roster impact and positional needs, I think Utah's done really well to land commitments across the board that address their general needs. So, looking at the roster and what Utah is projected to lose just from, the departing senior class, I think Utah's hit on all important spots. So, it's pretty well set, where you've got 16 seniors on the roster. 5 of those are offensive linemen. And then you've got a couple of tight ends, a couple of running backs, a couple of linebackers, and then a safety, a cornerback, a defensive tackle, and then 2 receivers as well. So to this point, Utah's addressed those needs specifically with the quantity. Obviously, the offensive line, that's going to be really interesting to see how different it looks next year. Obviously, with 5 departing seniors, you've got those 5, but then you also have Caleb Lomu and Spencer Fano, who could depart as early departures for the NFL draft. And that will obviously impact the needs for Utah along the offensive line. And then obviously we know that the transfer portal is always a factor, but just based on what we know right now about Utah's 2026 roster, I think the coaches have done a really good job of recruiting to address their positional needs. So just across the board, they've added a couple of safeties, a couple of cornerbacks. They've added a defensive end and a defensive tackle in the class. They've hit on quarterback, running back. They've added 3 receivers so far and 2 tight ends. So they've addressed that needs. And then they've added 3 offensive linemen. So obviously a good amount of work still to do on the offensive line, given that you could potentially lose 7 players from that group. But I think Utah's done well so far of addressing that need. Obviously, the transfer portal will also be a factor for the offensive line specifically. So Utah's done well there. Beyond filling, just the general needs in terms of numbers, guys departing and what you need to backfill those positions, I think Utah's also done a really good job of bringing in certain players that fit needs on projected timelines. So you have different timelines in terms of when you want or need guys to be able to commit or contribute, I should say. And I think Utah's added a couple pieces that help on that front. So, outside of offensive line and receiver, there isn't a position group that faces a significant need, for an instant impact player. So coaches have been able to recruit prospects that fit their developmental needs, 1 or 2 years down the road. But there are two positions that I think are definitely in need of instant impact potential. Obviously, number one, the offensive line, like I just painted, just the picture that I just painted with 5 departing seniors and 2 potential NFL draft picks. Utah will likely be starting a completely new offensive line next season. Fortunately, Jim Harding has not only recruited really well over the years, he's also retained his players really well. He's got a handful of guys who will be going into their 3rd, 4th, and even 5th seasons next year with the program. So that's pretty significant to have guys in place behind, that serve as depth right now behind the current starting line. Guys like Ike Garcia, Keith Olson, Soloto Moayai. Those guys are going to be key pieces in 2026 that'll help take on the starting roles. And so that sort of helps Utah in terms of what they need next year. But Utah still wanted to add an instant impact lineman in this cycle, and they've done that with Kelvin Obot, who is absolutely capable of following the Fano Lomu blueprint of being an instant impact starter at offensive tackle, and playing his way into a 3-year guy, potentially departing for the NFL after 3 years. He is absolutely in that mold. So I think Utah's done well there to add somebody that can come in right away and help things. They've also added 2 pieces in Rowdy Pierce and Moses Sparks that also fit sort of that 1 to 2 year timeline for depth as well. So I think Utah's pretty determined to add another instant impact guy, which could be in the transfer portal for the offensive line. But again, Utah, they're potentially going to lose a significant chunk of this offensive line, but they've got a lot of depth currently in that room where you can build forward going into 2026 and then add a couple pieces from this cycle to help improve the depth and potential of that spot next year. So beyond the offensive line, the other group that I think is in need of potential impact player is the receiver room. And with Micah Simon taking over, this unit has undergone a complete overhaul. I think Simon has done actually a pretty impressive job so far based on what he's brought in in the transfer portal. Going back to the winter cycle, and then the spring cycle, bringing in Tobias Merriweather and Larry Simmons. I think those are really encouraging additions for the roster this year. But then, this cycle, he's added Jaron and Kenan Pula, the Pula twins, and Perion Williams. I think Jaron looks like an instant impact type of receiver. Kenan is very similar, but will he stay at receiver? We'll see. And then Perion Williams, I think, is tailor-made for this offense in terms of what he brings to the table with his athleticism and how he fits in this offense. So I think Simon has done really well to add some potential impact players to that room as well. So obviously it's super exciting to have a guy like Obot committed. He's obviously the headline grabber and that. But I think what's really exciting is the players that Utah's added that have the developmental potential that Utah is so good at identifying is really exciting in my opinion. And when you look at this class right now, there are a handful of guys that stand out in this regard. I look at Preston Pitts, Javion Ramon, Major Hitchens, Josiah Jefferson, and Gary Mitchell as guys that I think have really promising potential in terms of their development potential at Utah. I interacted with Pitts at the red and white game back during the spring, or the 22 Forever game, the spring game And he has the sort of frame that can handle quite a bit more mass, which could significantly impact, his game and his potential as a defensive player, where he can play off the edge pretty consistently. I'm really excited for Pitts and what he could potentially become. It's kind of easy given the name, but he reminds me in terms of just his frame of Kylie Fitz, from about 10 years ago, whenever Kylie Fitz was at Utah. But they're very similar in terms of their build, where broad shoulders, long arms, sort of lean, big bodies, and I think that's sort of the development path that I envision for a guy like Preston Pitts. So he's one guy. Ramon is so technically raw. There's so much room for improvement in his game. Not to mention, his current size and frame as well. He posted a picture of him standing next to Luther Ellis. And if you've ever stood next to Luther Ellis, you know how big he is. And Raymond was bigger than Luther Ellis in terms of his height. Obviously, Luther's got a little bit more, mass to him. But Raymond is a guy that I'm really excited about and what he can become, at Utah. And the development, particularly in that defensive tackle room. So, he's a guy that's 6'5", 250 pounds right now. He told me that he's fully committed to get to 270 this year. And by the time he joins Utah next year, he wants to be pushing 300 pounds. And when you watch his film, you see the athleticism, you see how raw he is. And I get excited thinking about what he can become under a coach like Luther Ellis and what he's able to do. And then other guys, Jefferson is another guy that I'm really excited about in terms of what he could become at Utah. We saw sort of a similar player in Dalton Kincaid. They have similar backgrounds. So Jefferson only recently started playing football. He was a basketball player growing up, and you see the athleticism, you see the natural ability, but there's still a lot that he has to learn in terms of the nuances of the game and of his position, in terms of technique and really rounding out the rest of his game. Obviously, you see the athleticism and pass catching ability, but there's a lot more to that tight end position, and I think that's exactly where Utah can help him the most in making this transition. And to land him, over Oklahoma, where there are strong family ties to that program, I think was a significant win for Freddie Whittingham and the Utes. So he's another guy that I get really excited about. And then Hitchen and Mitchell both just have, really promising blends of athleticism and size, for their positions, where Hitchen is that 6'2", lanky, looks like Zemiah Vaughn in my opinion. And then Mitchell, he's just another one of those 6'3" linebackers, like a Kanai Lopes, like a Lander Barton-esque type of linebacker, and I really like just the development potential of those five guys. So those five guys, I really like their potential in terms of development at Utah, and I think that is something to keep in mind. Is as much as we want to boil down recruiting to a handful of numbers, right? Their 3-star, 4-star ratings, all of those things. I think when you actually look at what Utah has done to address needs for their roster, but then also diving more into the football stuff of it and the nitty-gritty details of it all, I think Utah has actually done really, really well to address not only position needs, but contribution needs in terms of timeline and when they need guys to contribute. They've also added guys with really promising potential and development potential, which is where Utah really butters their bread as a program. So I think Utah's, like I said, I think Utah's done well. Obviously, there's room for concern being, having the class ranked 52nd and 10th in the Big 12. Utah needs to be at the very least, in the top half of the Big 12 conference. That's where they need to be. They need to be in the mid-30s at the very least nationally on the recruiting trail. And I think those are things that Utah is mindful of, but at the end of the day, they don't, they're not worried about it. They're getting guys that they want. They're getting guys that they feel fit the mold, that fit the culture and identity and brand of Utah football. And that's what matters most. And so, we've still got a long ways to go, in the recruiting cycle. plenty of work to be done for Utah. I think Utah will end up with probably somewhere closer to 20, 22 commits. They finished last year with, I think, 24, with a number of those commitments coming in the month of December. So Utah's going to continue to evaluate and push for guys, potentially, looking to flip some players as well, which is always exciting. And I think, for Utah, which is built so much on substance, right? What are they actually producing on the field? What are they producing in the NFL draft? The substance of recruiting, I think, can really improve this season with a good year. So you get some momentum generated on the field, and I think that can help Utah significantly out as well. So that's what I've got on today's episode. Let me know what you think of Utah's recruiting needs. Obviously, again, we're all waiting on Celeste Mo. I know everybody is itching for that, for news and updates on that. It is, essentially down to Utah and Tennessee, and we're just sort of, it's a back and forth battle between those two programs, and Moa will come to his decision on his timeline. And so that's just kind of where we're at with that. But if you have any other feedback, any other questions or anything like that, please hit me up on Twitter, please, or reply on the YouTube, reply in the comments, wherever you can find me. Hit me up. It's been a lot of fun to get that interaction going again. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. I'll be back maybe with another episode this week. We'll see.